Het u al geregistreer by die Departement Militêre Veterane? U kwalifiseer vir voordele soos gratis medies, begrafnisdekking en meer. Gratis hulp met registrasie vir donateurs van die Veterane Bystandfonds. Stuur u naam of magsnommer na 31429.
Good afternoon. South Africa is on the road to an election that will make or break the future, say some analysts and commentators. One wants to see elements of boisterousness and robustness, which is indeed present if you look deeply, but the scandals of corruption, state capture, and incapability associated with the current government are just too dark and negative and overwhelming a cloud to really feel the good energy associated with the aforementioned elements. So to try and make sense of what is happening, Nuuspod started a conversation series with some of the country's most well-known leaders in different fields. And today I have with me Mr. Tony Leon, the former leader of the DA. Good afternoon, Tony. Welcome to Nuuspod.
Hello, goedemiddag, Isa. Baie dankie. Thank you very much.
How are you? What are you doing nowadays?
Nowadays, what I'm currently doing is busy promoting my book, which is why I was very keen to speak to you, called Future Tense, Reflection on My Troubled Land, which came out just in March, and I've been going around the country, both in person and virtually, as one has to do, promoting it, because it's an important testament of how we got to where we are, where we're likely to go, and some of the roadblocks. I think we used to call them struikelblokkies, by van hulle in South Africa. And I used a lot of my, not just the data that we've all got available, but my own personal insights, because for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, as we say when we get married, I've been involved either directly or indirectly with every president of South Africa, from F.V. de Klerk right through to Cyril Ramaphosa and all stops in between, including the great Nelson Mandela, the mixed bag Thabo Mbeki, the very bad Jacob Zuma, and of course our current president. And so that's the one aspect that I've managed to look at through some of their lenses as I've encountered them. And then obviously from the opposition, which, as you know, I led in this country for 13 years in one form or another, including 7 at the helm of the DA as it's currently constituted. 2 of the chaps in my book deal with some of the problems that were encountered by the official opposition party after the 2019 general election and to date. So and then obviously the economy, because you know, we can all have views about politics, but in a country that's running out of money or has run out of money, there's a lot of constraints. And so my book really, although in an accessible way and in a meaningful way, I hope, that's for readers to decide, tries to unpack this, but also telling some of the human stories behind it. As my publisher says, it's the color to what is normally a black and white picture. So that's currently what I've been very busy with these last 2.5 months. And yeah, I'm pleased the book's done very well. It's been the top 10 for 2 months. And I hope that people engage with it rather than the headlines they might read about it, some of which are extraordinary.
I just wanted to ask you, that's the book that got you into trouble.
Well, it was an interview relating to the book that allegedly got me into trouble. I might say I didn't apologize, except I felt necessary to explain words in their ordinary context, not words as some race-baiting warrior might choose to put on them, as happened, because we all live in the age of Twitter, and that's a pretty sewage, like a running sewerage goes through a lot of the Twitter accounts in South Africa and in the world. And in fact, one of my chapters deals with the issue of free speech and how difficult it is today in South Africa and in the world, because we've got a deep sense of instant, often false outrage, which tends to narrow the debate rather than expand it. So it's all very well to have a very impressive constitution, but a lot of the roots in our constitution have been ripped out by the very men and women who were meant to safeguard it. These people are called the men of zeal, and there are many of them in our midst, sadly. So we've got it's, you know, we thought we planted a mighty oak, Isaac. It's actually more like a bonsai tree. It's got a very small growth, our constitutional space in this country. And then the last chapter of the book deals with what I call future tense, which is the title of the book, 9 signposts of where I think we will land up in this country. So that's my book, and that's my analysis. I've been busy with that. Obviously, I'm also, put groceries on the table. I'm the chairman of a company called Resolve Communications, which does, I think, good and impressive work in the realm of advocacy and stakeholder management for private sector companies. And we've had that for the last 7 years. It's been quite successful. And I also write. So apart from books, I'm a contracted columnist for the Sunday Times Business Day and Sunday Times Daily. So that keeps me busy, thinking about things and putting my thoughts out there, and including nowadays on platforms like yours, because this is the new media after all. So that's me in a nutshell.
There you have it, Tony Leon. And I think one of the questions that I wanted to put to you later, but let me put it now. Isn't it ironic how the very people that fought for a more open and inclusive South Africa seems to be the people jumping onto you and want to kill healthy debate and healthy conversations?
I think it is ironic. It was almost inevitable because the Constitution, and I was very involved in those negotiations at Kempton Park way back when in 1991 through to 1993, and then again in the Constitutional Assembly and Parliament between 94 and 96. Of course, at the beginning, and this was even before the ANC came to power, the ANC was really dealing with its own experience of having been in exile, having been in opposition. They hadn't been in government. So they were rather generous in the rights that they were prepared to co-author. The National Party, ironically, was less generous because they'd been in power for 46 years, didn't quite understand what it was like to be out of power. They quickly learned that lesson until they disappeared a few years later. So the ANC started from a very different position to the position the ANC is in now, where the ANC now, really in some way mimics the Pierre Botha regime in the following sense. So we have been, because the public health disaster in this country under coronavirus, under a continuous, this is really going on now for 14, 15 months, national state of disaster, which actually allows the government to more or less regulate and legislate as it chooses. It doesn't have to go to Parliament. It doesn't have to explain, doesn't have to open to the processes. And it's mightily enjoyed this. It's not just about public health. I mean, you don't close the beaches, which are the best place to be if you want to stop the spread of coronavirus, fresh air, open air, social distancing. They just closed the beaches because they could close the beaches, or they banned people smoking cigarettes for 6 months. There were no health, it didn't help interdict coronavirus, that. But, in Kusasana, Dlamini Zuma doesn't like cigarette smokers, fair enough. But so she used the excuse of the coronavirus to just ram things through she wouldn't have otherwise been able to do in a parliamentary, open, transparent, democratic fashion. And Ibrahim Patel, the past master of it, he just did everything from controlling the prices of things to banning the sale of cooked food at one stage. So these are the folk who say they are Democrats, revolutionaries, whatever they call themselves, and they Democrats with a small d, but actually they've been very undemocratic. And why I said Pierre Botha, because a lot of South Africa, when I was getting into politics, was governed under a state of emergency. That's because of the public safety issues, because of the struggle against the apartheid regime of the time. And so most decisions weren't taken by Parliament or by the courts. They were taken by the State Security Council. And ironically, here we are in 2021, we're more or less in the same situation with a different imperative. Then it was security, now it's public health. But if you give too much power to too few people in secret, without answerability and accountability, then you don't live in a constitutional democracy. You're living in another state. And we seem to be mimicking, sadly, a lot of the old regime, albeit that we, or our political masters and mistresses, spend a lot of time telling us how terrible it was, but they have taken some of the worst habits of that regime and are applying them here and now, which is, as you say, an irony or a paradox indeed, and a sad one.
Tony, looking back to CODESA, when you were involved in those talks, did did you believe things are going to be different? How does the picture differ now from the one you had at that time and you believed in?
Well, obviously, I grew up in a home and in my earliest political days in opposition to the National Party government, although if you listen to some of the rubbish spoken today, every white was in favor of apartheid and all blacks were against it. Well, that wasn't actually true. There were a lot of black collaborators in the apartheid system, in the homelands, in the police force and the security services who were very much propping up the apartheid regime. On the other side of the barricades, when I became a Democratic Party MP, and that was the most, admittedly in a restricted system, the most left-wing, non-racial party, which wanted constitutional negotiations, wanted the ANC to participate, we got over 20% of the vote. So you could say 1/5, at least, of white South Africa was against apartheid, 4/5 were in favor of various forms of it. But that doesn't matter now because everyone's got the memory of a goldfish, so they don't actually even have any interest in the real story of the past. The past is simply used, history is simply abused and misused, as I describe in this book, to advance a particular political agenda rather than realistically tell the story. But before I got into politics and after I qualified as an attorney, I was a lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Witwatersrand, and the senior professor in the subject was a man called Johan van der Vyver, and he said something that I always kept in the front of my mind. I talk about it in this book a lot. He said, if you ever get the chance to write a constitution, make sure you write it with the idea that your worst enemy, not your best friend, might come into power. And many years later, in exactly the same theme, the esteemed former Deputy Chief Justice of South Africa, Dinsdag Moseneke, said that at CODESA the problem was, he wouldn't quite describe as a problem, but clearly was, as we know, is that we designed a constitution with Mandela in mind, and then didn't quite finish the sentence, we landed up with Zuma. So from the beginning, I always had doubts about, I thought the ANC, although there were some remarkable individuals, Joe Slovo, Nelson Mandela, he was a subject of another book I wrote, Walter Sisulu, there were some giant figures on the ANC side, few left, but there were many then. But I thought if you took out those outstanding personalities and put them to one side, the movement itself was not really at home with freedom. They weren't they might have called themselves freedom fighters, but they didn't really believe in individual freedom. They came from the Soviet idea that the party knows what the people want. And there was a lot of that. So I was always skeptical that the ANC was going to be this new reborn democratic organization that would, enhance individual freedom and allow us to push forward the frontiers of liberty. I always had that doubt, and it was confirmed during those negotiations, not just with ANC people, but the ANC had some very bright minds that they'd made onto those technical committees that were writing the document. And these guys and some women were very resistant to putting in aspects of individual liberty. They were not that keen on it even back then, although we got quite a lot in because the ANC, of course, didn't have all the say then as they have now. So you could have marked me down as a skeptic then, and obviously everyone or many people become skeptics now after 27 years. And it's not because I had some divine insight or foresight, Isak. It was because I'd studied what they had to say, I'd interacted with them, and I thought, I'm a liberal, and not to make a big song and dance about labels, but I believe fundamentally in the freedom of the individual. I also believe, and then now and will always believe, in what Alan Paton, perhaps the foremost liberal in South Africa, ever said. He said, man was not born to go down on his belly before the state. And that to me is a very good positioning to have. The ANC, once it got control of the state, thought that all those provisions were simply an enabling method for them to get control. And then the actual democracy or constitution became much less important than the power of the state. And that's what we've seen, and that's what we continue to see, and that continues to be, to me, a major problem in this country.
What do you believe of the current ANC? Is there a possibility of change at a change of heart, a turnaround?
Well, there's always a possibility. I might say that when I got into Parliament in 1989, F.V. de Klerk had just been elected the leader of the National Party, and then became the state president in the same election that I got to Parliament. And he was hardly, liberal or left wing. He was what we used to call in the old South Africa, behoudende. He was the sort of conservative guy who beat the more liberal Barend du Plessis by really half a dozen votes to become the leader of the National Party. And du Plessis, not Barend, was regarded as being the more verlig, and FV was more for Crump. Well, of course, he turned all that on its head a few months later on the 2nd of February and changed South Africa in one speech, as we know. So nothing is impossible, improbable perhaps. I've had no indication. Look, I was strange enough in a conversation with a group of leading businessmen in Cape Town. They said, oh, well, it's very important that Cyril prevails against ACE. I said, well, yes, it is. But I said, tell me, guys, and these were informed people. They knew their onions, at least in business. What does Cyril actually stand for? Is he a socialist? Is he going to help minorities in this country? They had no idea. Now, the reason they had no idea is nobody actually knows. And Cyril has said some pretty radical things. I think he called at one of the speeches I mentioned here, was in Bergville in KwaZulu-Natal on Reconciliation Day, the old Dingons Day, where he called the Piet Retief and his cohorts invaders, which was a rather strange description of them, given the circumstance in which they were killed, but that's how Cyril chose to depict them. So he says one thing and then, says another thing, depending on the audience who's present. And, the first chapter of my book starts with a speech he gave in New York, which is the first time I'd seen him since he became president in 2018. And he said, well, reforms are going to come fast and furious. We've been too slow. Now, bear in mind, this is September 2018. Well, hello, we're now in May 2021, and we're still arguing over many of the same reforms, and the country's economy has been driven into a ditch. So if you said to me, given a choice between Ramaphosa and Magashule, of course, Ramaphosa is better because he's not completely reckless. He's not corrupt in the way Magashule is. He's not demonic in any of the ways that the RET faction are, and he doesn't, favor corruption the way they do, and he hasn't, as far as we know, and I'm sure that's correct, benefited from it. But that being said, what is the difference? In his appearance before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry recently, he doubled down on cadre deployment, and the fact that we have our municipalities require about, I read the figure, 61 billion rand to get them right size. They have spent billions, and as the Tito Mboweni says, we've got nothing to show for it, except potholes, lack of water, lack of infrastructure, falling apart roads and so on. And that's directly a result of putting people into office who, first of all, don't have the qualifications, and secondly, look at these as sites of plunder and looting rather than serving the people. But although Cyril says the right things about corruption, he won't depart from what you might call the gateway drugs into corruption, which is cadre deployment, because that's what these folk do who get deployed into positions for which they aren't accountable and certainly don't have the qualifications, or through BEE, which simply allows a whole cohort of middlemen, rentiers, as we've seen in some of these terrible exposés, to simply fleece the taxpayer and ruin our state-owned enterprises. So, and indeed on state-owned enterprises, I mean, for God's sake, the thing is staring us in the face. We've got some excellent private sector companies in this country, but instead of taking the examples of them or getting them in to run the things or selling off these assets, we say we want more state control. And so I don't see Cyril, even if he prevails in his power struggles inside, changing any of that. In fact, he's told us he won't change any of that. He says he's going to intensify these policies. So, it's not, there are no signs. I don't want to say there never will be, because sometimes when you're in a desperate corner and the bond market, sends you into the penalty corner and your currency crashes. At the moment, the currency is doing very well, not because of us, because of the commodity prices, because of the American inflationary expectation, and because of the enormous amount of liquidity through quantitative easing that we're seeing in the world. So we are the beneficiaries of that, but will we use this space to reform our central policies? No sign of it. So I have to say that I'm not sure, other than having someone less worse in charge of the ANC, there will, under the ANC, be any change. On the other hand, the ANC is laughing all the way at the bank because the voters keep voting for it. So, why change when you benefit?
I've got a friend who always says, dis moontlik, maar hoogs onwaarskynlik.
Ek dink dis die regte slagspreuk en dis myn insiens ook. Ja.
Tony, what do you expect from the ANC in the coming election?
I don't expect anything from the ANC in terms of, they'll say all the right things, they always do, and then we have another 5 years of disastrous misrule. I mean, I don't run the DA, but I mean, the 5 best run municipalities in South Africa by an objective metric announced the other day are all DA run. So if you want to live in a better governed place, you vote DA. If you want to live in a worse governed place, vote ANC. But the folks keep voting for the ANC, even in areas where their sewerage is running in the streets. So I don't think the ANC will be saying they'll make some announcements, they'll talk about better services. In reality, it'll get worse. But if you ask me what do I see in terms of results, I'm looking at the by-elections that were held last week and reading the excellent analyst Wayne Sussman, who really crunches the numbers in a very impressive way. He says the ANC is on course to a big victory and the DA is going to get a bloody nose. Now, look, a lot can happen between now and October. We don't even know if October is going to happen because some of those parties are very anxious that there not be elections, including the EFF, which doesn't seem to be able to win one of them. But on the current trends, I think the ANC is going to do well. I think the opposition will have a setback compared to 2016. But will it change anything? No. Because actually, one of the points that I make in this book is that it doesn't really matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter who gets what percentage, short of the ANC being voted out completely, because at the end of the day, the decisions are made by the ANC NEC. And just to give you an example, I'm very frustrated, and I don't know, when this is going to change. I'm living in Cape Town. I'm meant to live in this very well-run province. And I'm over 60 years old, and I haven't got an appointment for a vaccination yet, although I was promised one last week, hasn't arrived. And I'm in the right category for the next, I'm waiting my turn. So I phoned a senior official in the provincial administration, whom I know from a long time ago. And I said to him, look, what gives? People in Johannesburg getting vaccinated, no one in Cape Town, you meant to be running a, much better shop here. I said, I'm still don't have my appointment. He said, but we don't control the appointments. They're controlled nationally. That database is national. So here you have the two things provinces are meant to do, have a lot of power, health and education. But actually, most of the decisions around health and education aren't taken in Cape Town, they're taken in Pretoria. And if Pretoria or whoever administers their vaccination data system is disinclined to do anything, nothing happens. So if you translate that into the wider South African picture, Isak, whether the ANC gets 52% the vote or 62% vote doesn't really matter, because there are 107 odd people, some of them very odd, some of them criminals, as we know, sitting in the NEC of the ANC, and they are the deciders. It's like the scheme I used in my book, borrowed from Hannah Arendt, the famous German philosopher. She spoke about dual authority, where you have the idea or the pretense or the appearance of a constitution, which has a lot of impressive things in it, or laws. But the real authority is not in the constitution. The real authority is not in parliament, even though we pay our R500 million a year to our legislators to legislate. The real authority sits in a small little committee of 107 people in the ANC NEC, and they're a country of 58 million people. And how they vote or who they vote for is much less important than the decisions made out of sight, off the balance sheet, as we say, in accounts by a cabal in the ANC. And they are the deciders, regardless of all the activity, noise, rallies that are held in the local elections. And that is very depressing, but I think it's also accurate. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, because they do have some powers, Cape Town is by any measure better administered than Johannesburg. And that's something to celebrate, but it's not saying that much.
But even then, the DA is battling to make grounds. Every time when you think they're going to make ground, they fall back. So let me ask you this. Do you agree with Sussman that the DA is going to get a blood nose?
Well, look, what he's done, and he does it very well, Wayne Sussman, he analysed every single by-election. I'll just look at it. This was published in the Business Day this morning. He analysed every single by-election since 2016 in South Africa, and he says the DA has lost 29 of them, the ANC's lost 5. And, what he's saying, if that trend continues, then bloedige neus is the uitslag. But, look, the caveat here, and this is my view, and it's not just because I happen to, be an old straighter or spondy DR. The caveat on Wayne Sussman, who's an excellent analyst, probably the best we have, is that it's the old dilemma. All our information comes from the past. Those are past by-elections up to the last week. But all our decisions are about the future. So although the past doesn't go in a straight line into the future, I mean, a lot can happen between now and October when the election is. And I don't want to say inevitably the DA is on a sort of downward slide, because they have the ability still, they've got a lot of efficient people to change that narrative. But, it's late in the day and they need to get going. So, it's not, nothing is inevitable. But what Wayne has done in that is simply to look at the results to date.
Why do the DA manage to run or govern superbly wherever they are in control, but as a party they failed to get those what do you call it? Ek is nou my Vrystaat Engels nou besig om
Afrikaans, ek verstaan.
Hoekom sukkel hulle so om politiek grond te maak? They battling to get ahead and get places to govern. They govern well, but they have problems.
Ek dink dit is die $64 vraag daardie een. Hoekom doen hulle goed op grondvlak waar hulle regeer, maar hoekom doen hulle nie goed wanneer by die stembus kom nie, of in die afgelope paar maande? Ja, dit is baie moeilike, dit is baie interessante moeilike vraag. Ek dink die antwoord is soos volg. People in South Africa, and I'm generalizing here, do not go into the voting booth and to stem lokaal and say, ja, hierdie is goeie mense, ek stem vir hulle, ek stem teen daardie mense, weens die feit dat hulle korrup of besig met bedrog is. I think, and it's not an original observation this, and it's not confined to South Africa, I think a lot of people vote for parties because it's a measure of who they are. So you might call it's part of their identity. So it's not so much voting because, this one governs well and that one governs badly. It's because it's part of my identity. Now, we are still, I guess, a young democracy. I mean, South Africans in the old days when whites had the power here and they had voted for many years, also were involved in identity politics. As they used to say when I became an MP in 1989, what they used to do was you'd divide up the voters' roll into English and Afrikaans. And you'd assume that all Afrikaans-speaking people would vote either KP or NP, and the English would vote DP or UP or whatever it was. And the battle was for those few voters who were floating in the middle, who weren't aligned to either camp, as it were. And that was a way of predicting elections in South Africa, with a few exceptions. Of course, there were Bloods up on the Afrikaans side, and there were Engelsers who voted Nat increasingly as the years went by. But still, they were a minority on both sides. And that is because a lot of Afrikaans identity was tied up with the National Party, which had been, after all, a volksbeweging partij. And a lot of Engelsers were voted against the National Party precisely because they didn't think the National Party looked after their interests as English. So that was a lot of white politics. Now we have an all-race democracy. We had 26 years, and we expect it to somehow be different from that. That's perhaps pushing hope over experience. So I think a lot of folk in South Africa, Isak, vote not because, you know, the Sunday Times front page shows you this wonderful picture of Mangaung. Where is it? Oh, no, this is somewhere else. Yes, Mangaung. This is Bloemfontein. This is what Bloemfontein looks like. It's this lelik, dis 'n verras, dis skokkend. Model 'n stem ANC in daardie gebied. En jy moet jouself vra. You know, it's like being an abused spouse. You know, you keep going back to your husband, even though your husband beats you. Oh, why? I mean, it's very odd. But there's a psychology in that. And there seems to be a psychology in our voting that unless people feel that part of their identity is in the party they vote for, they're not going to vote for the party, however good that party is. Now, you know, I look, the DA has really been trying hard since I was the leader, and that you go back along. I left the leadership in 2007. I thought, well, let me get out before I get pushed. But, you know, the party had gone from 7 seats to 15. We'd really tried to break through barriers. We'd broken through barriers among Afrikaners, overwhelming support us, Indians vote for us, coloureds vote for us, and a few black South Africans, not that many. And I thought, well, let me get out of the way and they can then move forward. And they did for a while, and then they went backwards. But it's not going to happen immediately. It's time and experience. But, you know, and maybe politics will have to be reformulated so you can create a more open system where other people can help come to the fore. I don't know. It's not an easy question, but I think that's part of the answer.
I remember my first week at the SABC, it was in 2012, near the end of 2012. Helen Zille was visiting us in the newsroom, and it was an editorial meeting that she was talking to. And I remember her saying in that meeting that the DA plans for 32% of the total vote in future. I wanted to make a story of it, but my editor at that time said, no, it won't be possible. But Helen was well on the way of doing that. And the DA was well on the way. I mean, they jumped up to 23%.
27 at once.
27 at once. So that they got very near to it.
They did. Look, a lot of it. And I don't, you know, Helen was a very successful leader, and Musi for a while was, and then profoundly was not. So he had a mixed bag. But the thing is, you must not overestimate these things. It doesn't matter how you get your votes. I mean, provided you don't crook and cheat and kill people to get them. But I mean, a lot of the DA percentages became very good because ANC voters weren't going to vote and DA voters were going to vote en bloc, as you remember. So there was a stay away by the ANC under Zuma. And the big difference with Ramaphosa coming in was the ANC voters went back to vote. And in fact, Fikile Mbalula, who is the ANC election head, or was in the last election, said, if it weren't for Cyril, we'd be at 40%, not 57 or whatever they got. So I think that's right. So a lot of the DA's success wasn't just the DA doing well, it was the ANC doing badly. And the Zuma doing particularly badly. And so, yeah, they were getting close, but they made the wrong assumption that somehow it would just continue. And of course, there was a change in the union buildings very profoundly in 2018.
So maybe the DA must, or South Africans shouldn't be too hard on the DA. They have their problems, but maybe, as you say, there are other situations and circumstances that is out of your control.
Absolutely. Look, the DA does not make the political weather in South Africa. They make some of the weather and where they govern in their own little corner. But, you know, I've said to John Steenhuisen and his fellow leaders, I said, look, it might be very unglamorous and unexciting if you've got only 20% of the vote. But, you know, if the ANC starts factionalizing and dividing and disappearing parts of it, your 20% could be very relevant on itself, on its own. It doesn't sound like much, but 20%, if there's a fracturing in the majority party, is very important. It can be the decision makers between who lives and who dies in political power. So I said, behold it. Obviously try and build in it, but also keep what you've got. That's my advice to them. It's not, of course, this is a lot less exciting than measuring the curtains for the union buildings. I need to point that out. But you never know. You can only control your own environment. You don't control the whole environment.
Tony, I've got 2 more questions for you, if you can bear with me. The one is from the last point you made. What you have just said is highlighting the fact that coalition politics is the future of South Africa. Only problem is we don't have a strong enough basis to uphold that from the looks of it, because the chances that the parties had to do that didn't come off very well. Your views on that?
No, well, it didn't. I mean, the local government experience was a disaster for the DA. I mean, in terms of these coalitions, because although Helen Zille kept hers together, this was a long time ago in Cape Town, but she was the head of a big party, the DA, which I was the leader of at the time, and all the other parties were very, very small. So it was, although I want to compliment her on doing it, it wasn't, it was easier to do than it, because the DA was just close to getting a majority in Cape Town in 2006. In Pretoria, well, they had other problems, but Joburg Joburg, actually, the DA got fewer votes than the ANC, but the ANC got so few that they were voted out because the EFF supported the DA. And that was the first problem. Doing business with the EFF is like putting Herod in charge of a crèche. I mean, the DA just got crushed by that. And Mashaba's caucus was in revolt against him because of what was going on. So that didn't work. But, never say never. You can't just say, well, we had bad experience, therefore we're never going to repeat anything. I think you've got to be much more cautious in the way they did it. But I think it's going to be interesting if the ANC gets below 50% nationally. Who will the ANC go into business with? The EFF or the DA? That's the question. And the DA doesn't control the answer, the ANC does. And, on what we've seen in ANC policy, they'll choose the EFF over the DA. But whether all of them will be happy with that is another matter. And some of them might be so shocked that they'd leave the ANC. So once you choose a partner, there are consequences. So I agree with you. I think that is going to be a pattern of the future. I mean, if that isn't going to happen, then, consign yourself to one party rule forever and a day. And we know the results. 46 years of the National Party, very bad. 27 years the ANC, very bad. Because, if you're unchallenged in power, you have no reason to change your behavior.
And that is exactly the basis of my final question. With keeping in mind with what you have just said. What should the man in the street, the gemiddelde Suid-Afrikaner, be doing to survive in this country in the coming years?
Well, look, I think it's very, very significant what's going on. And just to go back to my book, since we started with it, the last chapter of this book, the last section of the chapter is called 1,000 Points of Light. And that I borrowed from George H.W. Bush's speech in 1988. And what he was saying is that if you look at a country only through its government, it looks sometimes terrible. Ours looks shocking. I mean, literally, sewage in the street, blood running through hospitals. But if you look outside the state, in the rest of society, South Africa is a very impressive place. You look at the work of AfriForum in or Solidariteit in some of those rural municipalities, fixing it up where the ANC government has messed it up. You look at the work of Gift to the Givers, giving water, which the government or local government should be delivering in Grahamstown, but they didn't. Grahamstown changed its name, but they've just, messed up the service at the same time. During the coronavirus lockdown, my wife and I sat on a kitchen table making peanut butter sandwiches for the poorer folk in Cape Town who didn't have access to food. And there's nothing remarkable about that. What was remarkable, there were thousands of people in our suburbs doing that. I'd go on the next day to drop them off at the local spa in our in our shopping centre, and the shopping trolley would be overflowing. That would bring more and more because more and more Samis were arriving. And so South Africa is a good country filled with good people. It's got terrible governments. We've got a pattern of very bad governments. It seems to be uninterrupted since 48. So what I'm saying, if you want to survive, don't look to the state for your salvation. You know, my other friend, Ebba Dommersa, who's written a book, used to be editor of Die Burger, called Fortunes, The Rise and Rise of Afrikaans Billionaires. I mean, the fact is, there were a lot of Afrikaans folk who used to work for the government, and in 1994 they were transformed out of it, and they became entrepreneurs because what were they going to do? And, you know, one of those guys, a remarkable man called Dr. Chris van der Merwe, and, you know, he started a school in the backyard of the gemeente of Durbanville, NG Kerk. And that school today is Curo, which is the largest provider of private education in the country. There are something like 168 Curo schools in South Africa 20 years later. This is all because Chris van der Merwe and his wife couldn't get jobs in the Western Cape, dare I say, Department of Education, because they didn't have the right color. So, and they started this fantastic network of low-cost private schools. So there's a lot of examples of that. And I'm not saying, you know, it's always easy when the government messes up just the basics, but there are ways and means. And if you have little faith as I do in the state, you must put your faith and your initiatives into things outside the state. And then you'll stay sane and alive, hopefully, and maybe prosperous.
That's the advice of Tony Leon. Tony, thank you very much for making time for Nuuspod.
Pleasure. All the best, Isak. Tot ziens. Bye.
Kijk, tot ziens, Tony.
Verkeersboetes behels meer as 'n klein ongerief met minimale gevolge. Jy kan 'n kriminele rekord kry of probleme teekom as jy jou rybewys of motorlisensie hernie. En die metropolisie kan jou by padblokkades lastigval om die boetes te betaal. Fines for You vir minder moeite met verkeersboetes deur hul te monitor en vinnig, wetlik en effektief af te handel sodat jy nie die ongewenste gevolge hoef te dra nie. Ons spesialiseer in groot vlote en streef daarna om jou geld te bespaar. Kontak ons gerus op 011 867 7331 of besoek ons webtuiste by www.finesforyou.co.za.